All sorts of viruses, diseases, and other health-related nuisances abound in a galaxy far, far away. At present, the authors developing the franchise have concocted around 350 different diseases, ranging from an innocent equivalent of acute respiratory illness to highly dangerous and practically incurable mutagenic viruses that turn the infected into mutants or mindless zombies. Some viruses were intentionally created under laboratory conditions or through alchemy and ingenious witchcraft using the Force, and were then employed as biological weapons or mutagens. There were also viruses that, arising on their own, led to the demise or degradation of entire civilizations, while others transformed beings into zombies. Some viruses and maladies are well documented, while others are briefly mentioned in sources with just a sentence or two. Numerous diseases can be found among nearly every race in the vast galaxy far, far away. It was precisely a pandemic, among other factors, that caused the fall of one of the galaxy's greatest ancient civilizations, the so-called Infinite Empire of the Rakghoul species. The Rakghoul were exceptionally brutal amphibious humanoids, all endowed with the gift of the Force. The Rakghoul hated all races except their own, but even with their kind, they did not always act humanely. In the Infinite Empire, there certainly was a rigid power hierarchy, but sometimes the Rakghoul could collectively decide to annihilate, enslave, or engage in other forms of massive oppression against another race. Such was the fate of the Kwa and the Kumumga races. Even the Sith race suffered from them for some time before King Ardus intervened. The Rakghoul had considerable imperial aspirations. If it were not for their inherent gift of the mystical energy of the Force, and if not for the mentors from the Kwa race who taught the Rakghoul to harness the Force, the Rakghoul might have remained on Lehun, later known as Rakghoul Prime. At the peak of their empire, the Rakghoul's infinite empire spanned just over 500 planets, and the imperial army numbered 10 billion warriors. Under their command were over 1 trillion slaves. To the uninitiated, these may seem modest scales for an interstellar empire, but during those years, tens of thousands of years before the events of the films, there were not many intelligent and advanced races in the galaxy. Underdeveloped races did not interest the Rakghoul much, but even 500 colonized planets were a significant number. As their expansion continued, the Rakghoul unexpectedly faced the challenge of preserving the state's integrity. With each century, tensions grew between internal political factions. It could not go on forever, and around 25,200 BBY, a full-scale civil war erupted within the Infinite Empire. The Rakghoul were struck by a plague of unknown origin. Rakghoul scientists were unable to pinpoint the source of the infection. There was speculation that one of the enslaved races had created the plague. This hypothesis was logical, as the virus affected only members of the Rakghoul species, although it is entirely possible that this was the doing of other highly developed races, particularly the Noghri, who could not tolerate the Rakghoul. The Rakghoul were never able to find a cure for the disease, and given their selfish nature, there was no thought of quarantine or self-isolation. Only a few Rakghoul and their subordinates managed to isolate themselves from their kin. Some of these resourceful Rakghoul we encounter in Star Wars: The Old Republic, but even these are often in non-living form. As if civil war and mass extinction were not enough, the virulent plague, upon mutating, began to deprive the Rakghoul of the most precious thing they had, their connection to the Force. The Rakghoul were not just considered a race of wizards of sorts. Almost all of their technology operated on the Force, from hyperdrives to Force sabers. Everything worked on the energy of the Force. The enslaved races immediately rose up against their oppressors. In some places, the uprisings were successful, and the former slaves either destroyed their masters or drove them off the planet, while in others, such as on Tatooine, the uprising was not very successful. The Rakghoul, as a parting shot, destroyed the entire planet. The local race, the Kumumga, was almost wiped out. The few surviving Kumumga over time changed, mutated, splitting into 4 races, 2 of which survived until the events of the films, the Tusken and the Jawa. The pandemic, civil war, and excessive arrogance led the highly developed race to downfall and degradation. The Rakata regressed almost to a Neolithic level. The few Rakata who retained their intellect and memory of the past tried to acquire genetic material from Force users to regain their ability to feel and control the Force. But they failed. Neither the Rakata scientists nor the historians of future epochs could determine the source of the virus that destroyed the entire race. However, the next plague was undoubtedly of artificial origin, and we even know whose hands were behind it: the rakghouls. The rakghouls were first introduced in the iconic video game Knights of the Old Republic as part of the meager wild fauna of Taris, residing on the lower levels of the planet where non-human races and the poor lived. The locals had no idea where this plague, which turned all people without the gift of the Force into ugly, brainless monsters, came from. Some particularly religious citizens voiced theories of some mystical punishment for the alleged sins of society. It should also be taken into account that the inhabitants were also looking for the Promised Land. After the game, rakghouls were not mentioned in official sources for a long time. The surprising interest in rakghouls came from fans who unexpectedly liked this primitive wild wildlife. Respecting the fan interest, John Jackson Miller gave rakghouls special attention in the comic book series Knights of the Old Republic, which began publishing in 2006. In 2008, the rakghouls were discussed in the guidebook titled Knights of the Old Republic Campaign Guide. Subsequently, rakghouls were mentioned in several sources, one of which added further details. The greatest amount of information has been provided to us by the game Star Wars: The Old Republic. Rakghouls were artificially created, bypassing the laws of evolution. Their origin story is closely linked with the first Sith Dark Jedi, who were exiled in 6900 BBY, after a bloody internal war within the Jedi Order known as the 100-Year Darkness. This conflict lasted from 7000 to 6900 BBY. The creator of the incredibly contagious virus, later called the Rakghoul Plague, was one of the greatest Sith of ancient times, who was at the very foundation of the Sith Order itself, Lady Sorzus Sin. An alchemist, sage, historian, she had many talents. Sorzus created 3 talismans. One she gifted to her friend and colleague Carnis Moore, the second was given to Remulus Drypa, and the third, the most powerful, Sorzus Sin, kept for herself. Drypa and Moore were eternal rivals, always having different views on the nature of the Force and its application. A brief description of the talisman's construction and the methods of their creation were outlined by Sorzus Sin in one of her scientific works, in her extensive tome. However, the lack of details and the lack of understanding of ancient Sith magic by most Sith of later epochs did not allow for the artifact to be recreated. Where the talismans of Sorzus and Drypa vanished too is unknown. However, the fate of Moore's talisman and its owner is well known. Highly valuing the gift from Lady Sorzus, Moore hoped to create his own invincible army with its help and achieve immortality. He failed in the first endeavor, but was able to achieve the second to the fullest extent, transferring his mind and soul into the talisman. The talisman was not a golden cage, as it might initially seem. Anyone who wore the talisman unknowingly became the bearer of Moore's immortal and unscrupulous soul. Sometimes the Sith even managed to take control of the poor wearer's body, but in most cases, he merely influenced the actions of the bearer. Many Sith dreamed of possessing Moore's talisman, and were even prepared to kill their closest allies for it. Every holder of the talisman could turn any enemy within several hundred meters into a rakghoul, except for certain races such as shards and those who had sufficient potential in the Force. The gift of the Force served as a kind of safeguard to protect Sith from the talisman's energy. Despite the talisman disappearing without a trace several times and being found again centuries later, the rakghouls it created were extremely difficult to destroy. They existed for thousands of years. In terms of resilience, rakghouls were like cockroaches. On the aforementioned Taris, rakghouls survived for an exceptionally long time. After the devastating bombardment of Taris by the fleet of Darth Malak, they even became the dominant species on the planet, gradually exterminating the humans who survived the bombardment. Apart from Taris, the rakghoul plague was found on many planets, periodically breaking out in epidemics in unexpected places. Theoretically, the infection could be eradicated by imposing a strict quarantine, temporarily isolating infected planets until the rakghouls were completely exterminated there. Or one could follow the example set by the Mandalorians. When the massive Mandalorian base on Jebel was subjected to a widespread infection of the rakghoul plague, Cassius Fett ordered a massive nuclear strike on Jebel. This strike, delivered by nuclear missiles, incinerated the rakghouls and the remaining Mandalorians in a blaze. However, this measure prevented the spread of the rakghoul plague. Nonetheless, decisive nuclear measures and even large-scale quarantine were almost impossible to implement in the Star Wars realm across several dozen planets simultaneously. Thus, the rakghoul plague continued to wreak havoc on inhabitants for thousands of years. Although following the events of Star Wars, The Old Republic, it was encountered much less frequently. The likelihood of new outbreaks was reduced through the invention of a vaccine and the emergence of specialized units to combat rakghouls, including rakghoul hunter squads, formed by private individuals. The most renowned of these was the organization Thorn, created by the CEO of Galactic Solution Industries, Adalar Highland. The acronym Thorn stands for the Highland Organization for Rakghoul Neutralization. Thorn was involved in everything from vaccine development to the direct physical eradication of rakghouls. Adalar, who had personal vendettas against rakghouls, spared no expense in funding research, purchasing the best weapons, protective gear, and equipment for his fighters, and always attracted volunteers who could include us in the game Star Wars: The Old Republic. How could one get infected with the rakghoul plague? The Muir talisman transformed victims into rakghouls almost instantaneously. Even spacesuits didn't provide protection from the talisman as the infection infiltrated the victim through the Force, but that was the talisman. Regular infection occurred when rakghoul DNA entered the victim's bloodstream through saliva, when bitten or through claw marks. The incubation period depended on the victim's race, physical condition, and less frequently, the rakghoul subspecies, as different subspecies carried different strains of the virus. Additionally, the virus itself gradually mutated with each generation of rakghouls. The monsters could also reproduce naturally. For instance, on Taris during the years of the Cold War, billions of rakghouls inhabited the planet. In just one section of the ruined Upper City's sewer system, the population numbered several tens of millions of various subspecies, ranging from short gray rakghouls to large individuals with red skin up to 5 meters tall. The evolution of rakghouls occurred very rapidly. Within just 300 years, the result of evolution was the emergence of nekghouls, relatively intelligent bipedal beings with the gift of the Force. Rarely there were rakghouls nearly the size of a rancor. Such creatures were impervious to blades or blasters. Eradicating rakghouls with a counter-disease was almost impossible due to their very strong immunity. Fortunately, the rakghoul plague was not transmitted through airborne droplets. Otherwise, localized outbreaks would have caused a galaxy-wide pandemic. The virus's incubation period for most races ranged from 6 to 48 hours, but even at the early stages of infection, the infected began to lose their sanity and became aggressive. The first mutations also started to occur, including changes in DNA structure, skin pigmentation, bone transformation, and cartilage tissue mutations. The color of the eyes often changed as well. Some infected, even after transforming into rakghouls, retained remnants of reason and some knowledge from their previous lives, which allowed them to use tools, primitive weapons, and even some equipment. In other words, they were not mindless zombies. Since the Mandalorian Wars, many biologists and chemists have studied the anatomy of rakghouls. One of the most interesting topics for scientists was the permanent mutation of rakghouls' internal organs, and even their genetic structure. Rakghouls sometimes attracted the attention of the Knights and Masters of the Jedi Order, as well as the Sith Lords of the Sith Order. However, The Sith often simply admired the rakghouls as wonderful creations of the dark side. One such enthusiast was Sith Lord Vadis, who traveled to Taris to rescue them. She is quoted as saying, "The cruel Republican sycophants kill my children, these wonderful, sweet creatures. The Sith created them, and Darth Malak gave them magnificent domains where they can multiply and become stronger. Rakghouls are the children of all Sith." Even during the Mandalorian Wars, many doctors tried to find a cure for the rakghoul plague. Virologists in the Sith Empire under Revan and Malak managed to create a serum that could halt the infection process. However, it had to be administered immediately after the bite, before the first changes appeared. Even better, it should be administered before the rakghoul bites. The distribution of the serum on Taris was strictly limited. Several vials of serum and an injector were part of the standard medkit for Sith soldiers sent to the lower levels of Taris. During his brief stay on the planet, Revan found one such medkit on the body of a soldier torn apart by rakghoul claws. He used the found medicine to heal several residents and delivered the remaining vial to Dr. Zelkaforn. The doctor began synthesizing the medicine in larger volumes, planning to distribute it freely among all city residents. However, he did not have time to start production on an industrial scale. Soon, an orbital bombardment of Taris began by the Sith fleet, and Dr. Forn's laboratory was buried under the rubble along with him. Republican scientists were also searching for ways to combat the rakghoul plague. They managed to develop several antidotes that slowed the spread of the infection but could not completely cure the patient. Dr. Yana Sel made the most progress. Not only did she study the virus and conduct her own research, but she also tried to find a cure in the clinic of the aforementioned Zelka Forn, or rather in what was left of it after the orbital bombardment. With the help of our character, she succeeded. The serum was in good condition, but to synthesize antibodies, the doctor needed a fresh infection sample from someone who had not yet turned into a rakghoul. The volunteer mercenary, namely us, had to go to meet the local toothy and clawed fauna again, risking a collision with rakghoul. After taking a sample, Iana created an antivirus and tested it on the same volunteer, that is, us, curing the poor soul of the infection. Thanks to this, Iana Sel developed an effective vaccine against the rakghoul plague. However, it was necessary to administer it no later than a couple of hours from the moment of infection, before irreversible changes began in the body. Sith scientists didn't stand aside either. Much information about rakghouls was obtained by the Imperials from Dr. Mola Haxtor, captured in the early stage of the Battle of Taris in 3642 BBY. Apart from the search for a serum, the Sith Empire scientists pondered how to use rakghouls as weapons. The ideas ranged from simply releasing several hundred captured rakghouls into the target area to manipulating the human genome. During one of their studies, Imperial biologists created a controlled rakghoul mutation. The infected could change their appearance at will, transforming from an ordinary human into a rakghoul. Even when the infected assumed a human form, ordinary rakghouls would not react to them, perceiving them as one of their own. The work to combine human and rakghoul genes to breed future super soldiers was conducted under Project Protean. One of the leading scientists of the project was Dr. Eckhard Loken, who simultaneously served as an Imperial intelligence operative under the codename Fixer 15. Loken tested his own developments on himself, which aided him in completing several covert operations. The study of rakghouls was also undertaken in some other states. The greatest success was achieved by Dr. Sanus Lorik. During the Great Galactic War from 3681 to 3653 BBY, he held the position of scientific advisor to the reigning monarch and simultaneously headed his own laboratory, where he engaged in genetic engineering and virus creation. After conducting a series of illegal and inhumane experiments, resulting in the deaths of 15 people used as test subjects, Sanus was exiled from Tion. But the exile established a new laboratory on Ord Mantell, swearing revenge on Tion. His passion now became rakghouls, which he saw as the perfect tool for retribution. With the help of hired smugglers, Sanus infected 5 planets of the Tion hegemony with the rakghoul plague. The population of 4 of them was soon almost entirely killed by rakghouls or turned into rakghouls themselves. However, the population of the planet Kion managed to withstand. The inhabitants of Tion fought against the rakghoul plague as best as they could, but they couldn't cope. They had to call for help from the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic. At that moment, the Imperials and the Republicans were negotiating the annexation of Tion and decided to use the rakghoul plague outbreak to their advantage. After all, Tion was rich and developed, capable of becoming a good source not only of funds but also of military supplies, which was very important in the ongoing war. Republican and Imperial forces directed their troops to Kion and scorched all the rakghouls there. Maintaining independence, the inhabitants of Tion, possessing powerful industry, traded with both warring sides. In ancient times, in a distant galaxy, there were many other plagues from which millions and even billions of people perished. One can also recall the Iridian plague. In ancient times, from the 5th to the 4th millennia BBY, it was considered one of the most dangerous diseases. Epidemics of the Iridian plague periodically erupted throughout the galaxy. For a long time, the plague was considered almost incurable. Representatives of various races could become infected, and the mortality rate was nearly 100%. Fortunately, the plague did not become a pandemic of galactic proportions, being limited to regional epidemics. The Iridian plague exists in both the old and new canons. However, in the new canon, we know who eventually developed the life-saving vaccine. It was a race of scientists and thinkers, the Ta Nuna. By the way, one of the compliments repeatedly given to the mercenary Kalo Nord was the phrase, "He has killed more people than the Iridian plague." Of course, this was a gross exaggeration, but such a comparison pleased Kalo Nord's ears. Mention of another disease also relates to legendary bounty hunters, the Karatos plague, a highly contagious viral infection. If spores of this virus came into contact with a human or near-human race, within approximately 40 minutes, they would lose their sight, and within the next hour, their brain would die. Jango Fett carried the spores of the Karatos plague in special containers within his armor. On one occasion, Jango decided to poison Count Dooku, but poisoning a Sith is no easy task. Nevertheless, the Count survived. Another ancient contagion, briefly mentioned in Knights of the Old Republic, is the Ardroxian flu. According to Jedi Jolee Bindo, it was a highly contagious and deadly strain of flu that many non-human races, including Wookiees, could contract. This flu caused several local epidemics. Humans likely had a natural immunity to the Ardroxian flu. There are no further details about the flu. Jolee himself mentioned the flu only superficially while visiting Kashyyyk, as an analogy when describing the relationship between Chieftain Chundar and the Churka Corporation. In general, there were an incredible number of flu varieties in the distant galaxy, but most of them were regional and did not become pandemics, and rarely caused epidemics on individual planets. However, some types of flu spread far beyond their native planets. For example, the Balmorra flu, briefly mentioned in the novel The New Jedi Order, the Unifying Force. Han Solo once caught it on Dantooine, a planet hundreds of light-years away from Balmorra. Brief mentions of this flu can be heard in NPC dialogues in Star Wars, The Old Republic, during visits to Balmorra. In Star Wars, The Old Republic, while wandering through Taris, one can encounter several Republican soldiers in a field hospital suffering from the Chilean flu. As can be easily inferred, this strain of flu originated on Chilla, the home planet of the Chiss. Considering that the Chiss have, on multiple occasions in the future, invented and utilized biological and chemical weapons, it is plausible to assume that the Chilean flu has an artificial origin. Humans and members of most near-human species could contract the Xilian flu, such as the Chiss, Mirialan, Kifar, Thelin, Zeltron, Miraluka, Arcanians, and other similar species that directly descended from humans or are genetically close to humans for various reasons. Humans and near-human species could also be infected by other flu variants, for example, the Dantari flu. Those who received timely medical assistance rarely died from it, although if left untreated, death could occur during an epidemic. Although there were no large-scale epidemics of the Dantari flu, or perhaps we are simply unaware of them, the same cannot be said about the Findris flu. It was exceptionally contagious and therefore quite widespread throughout the galaxy. Rarely fatal, it was notable for another reason. A person or another species that had already recovered, even if they had experienced mild or asymptomatic cases, could still act as a source of infection. The scale of infection with the Findris flu was significant. The flu was named after the planet where it was first discovered. Findris is the capital planet of the Haldane sector, located in the Grid Square, M9 region. Again, in Star Wars: The Old Republic, on that same terrace, there is a brief mention of the Geonosian swamp flu. However, despite the name, humans could also contract it. Generally, humans in Star Wars are susceptible to a vast number of diseases. However, races like the Hutts or the Vong are difficult to infect with anything. Some flu strains evolved on their own, while scientists who planned to use the flu as a weapon also facilitated this. But the flu was a minor issue compared to some other artificial viruses. Another very intriguing man-made plague, which the Sith also had a hand in creating, was the Techno virus, which turned its victims into mindless zombies, known as Techno beasts. The lady who created them referred to the warriors of her army as the Metanecrons. This unique technovirus was created using Sith alchemy and the Force. When applied correctly, the virus could turn any flesh and blood creature into a semi-metallic or sometimes fully metallic being within several hours or, in rarer cases, several days. The resulting creature was completely under the control of the Master, who had released the virus using the Force, or had traditionally introduced the technovirus into the victim's blood. Synthetic zombies were created using the Reaper technology from the bodies of organic species. The first techno beasts are encountered in the encyclopedia The New Essential Guide to Droids, published in 2006. They appeared on the pages of Drew Karpyshyn's novel Darth Bane: Rule of Two, the following year in 2007. More precisely, the novel was ready 2 years prior, but was only sent to print in 2007. The creator of the techno beasts in the distant galaxy was a very talented lady from the Sith Order, often undeservedly overlooked by fans. Her name was Belia Darzu. She was of the Shiido race. Considering the shape-shifting abilities of her race, it was expected that Belia Darzu would become an assassin, like many Sith of her race. There was even a Sith Academy on her planet, by the way. But no, Belia exhibited astonishing abilities in alchemy, robotics, and her Force potential was something many could only envy. However, she also mastered her 3 swords, 2 regular ones and 1 lightsaber, with complete expertise. Regarding the Force, in particular, Belia Darzu, while experimenting in her fortress on Tython, mastered a very rare method of using the Force known as Mechu Deru Vitae. The Sith Lady settled on a former Jedi planet, from which the Jedi had long departed. As you probably know, the Force binds all life in the galaxy. But with droids, those who use the Force often encountered problems. Most Force-sensitive beings couldn't sense them through the Force. Most, but not all. Those who use the Force from some orders, not just Jedi and Sith, could not only sense droids, but also influence their electronic brains using the Force. This was particularly true for silicone-based races such as shards. They understood any robot or computer at an instinctual level. Shards only used droid bodies out of necessity, as their own race appeared to be ordinary-looking crystals, incapable of independent movement. However, flesh and blood Jedi also had the ability to sense and influence droids through the Force. For example, Jedi Master Arca Jeth and Knight Leia Nerez. Leia Nerez even believed that one day, droids would be able to sense and use the Force, a notion not taken seriously by other Jedi. And those who used the Force, who mastered the art of manipulating inanimate matter at the atomic level, learning to restructure stone, metal, and other materials into whatever they desired, were exceedingly rare. Belia Darzu possessed such talents. She became a Dark Lord, The title Darth was not used then, and the head of her small state, her empire. This occurred in 1250 BBY, during the height of the new Sith Wars. Belia, in alliance with the Sith Order, Macrosa Order, led her army of half-mechanical zombies, Sith, and a few living soldiers against the Republic and the Jedi. This period was later named by historians as the Sictis Wars. The Sictis Wars continued for 20 years, from 1250 to 1230 BBY. Throughout its course, Belia Darzu created mechanical zombies from the bodies of fallen enemies, and sometimes from still living flesh. Techno beasts themselves could infect victims with a technovirus. This happened upon contact, resulting in an epidemic akin to the rakghoul plague. But unlike the rakghoul plague, there was no cure against this manifestation of alchemy and the Force, except perhaps the Force itself. One Jedi, whose name remained lost to history, managed to survive the virus infection by healing himself with the Force. He retained his mind but could not revert the affected parts of his body back from metal to flesh. Thus he remained partially mechanical, earning the moniker Techno Beast Jedi. When technovirus entered the bloodstream, the first signs were metallic tumors on the body. Then the virus, gradually transforming the flesh, reached the brain. The Jedi and the Republic did not know how to deal with such an army armed with blasters and vibroblades. They were at a loss from the very first encounter with them. Belia betrayed her allies from the Macrosa Order. The Macrosa Order was a very peculiar and therefore very interesting order of Sith assassins from the Tapani sector. Members of this order preferred to use poisons and lightsabers much less frequently. Macrosa assassins, with the help of a jealous apprentice of Belia Darzu, poisoned the Sith lady in her fortress on Tython. With the death of Darzu, there was no one left within the Sith Order who could take control of the entire army of cybernetic zombies. Most of the leaderless techno-beasts were quickly eliminated by the finally relieved Republic and Jedi. However, some techno-beasts survived, and were used by certain Sith Lords until the end of the new Sith Wars. Darth Bane had to deal with them as late as 250 years after Belia Darzu's experiments. This happened in 990 BBY. Metanecrons could not reproduce like rakghouls, but they lived very long and nearly destroyed Bane, the creator of the Rule of Two. Bane was saved by Orbalisk armor, which prevented the spread of infection, and his skills with the lightsaber. Now let's talk about the blackwing virus, also known as the Imperial Bioweapons Project 171A. Notably, this virus exists both in the original Star Wars universe and in the new canon. The blackwing virus was created by Sith alchemist Darth Dreer in 3645 BBY in the laboratories of the Sith Academy he founded on the planet Oda-Sir Faustan. This is within the Outer Rim territories in the Estran sector, grid square Q5. The Sith was merely seeking a cure for his death, to make his body immortal. But as a result, he created a virus from which he himself died. Science is not only fascinating, but also dangerous, even if you have the Force. Darth Dreer preserved the formula of the elixir and the method of its production in a holocron of his own making. 1,000 years later, the coveted holocron was found by the then head of the Sith Academy, Darth Scabrous. He too sought to attain immortality. In the Sith Academy, a local zombie outbreak began. During the era of the Galactic Empire's zenith, the virus was discovered by Darth Vader and his master. His master planned to retrieve virus samples from the planet Oda-Sir Faustan, study them, possibly modify them, and subsequently use them either as a weapon or as a means to create a zombie army. Yes, the blackwing virus can be considered somewhat intelligent, but more on that later. To avoid endangering inhabited planets and civilian populations, the research was conducted aboard the retrofitted Imperial I-class star destroyer, Vector. This ship was supposed to deliver the samples to an Imperial research base on the planet Konji 7, located in the Prefspelt sector of the Outer Rim territories, grid square J5. However, the star destroyer never reached the base. One of the virus containers was damaged during transport. The zombie virus broke free and within a few hours infected nearly the entire crew of the ship. which numbered 46,700 individuals. This included the ship's crew, scientists, soldiers, and officers. Only 30 Imperials, led by Commander Gorista, managed to hide from the zombies, albeit not for long. Just imagine, 46,000 armed zombies. The infected entirely lost their minds and became part of what can be described as a collective mind, communicating telepathically. Zombies could somewhat operate machinery, such as turret-mounted cannons, and shoot blasters. The zombies were very slow, but this was compensated by their resilience. In many fictional worlds, zombies are very resilient unless you shoot them in the head. The zombies acted as a unified swarm and were capable of coordinated attacks. Sometime later, the Imperial Purge prison barge docked with the drifting zombie-infested ship. The vessel had damaged engines. The crew hoped to find the necessary repair parts on the Vector. Consequently, the crew and prisoners of the Purge also became infected with an unknown virus that killed its victims in a short time, turning them into bloodthirsty zombies. There was a cure for the blackwing, but it had to be administered either before infection or at the very least before the first symptoms appeared. That is, no later than a few minutes after being bitten by a zombie. You might be wondering why I am recounting all this if the outbreaks of the blackwing virus were localized. First the Sith Academy, then 2 Imperial ships. And this virus still caused an epidemic, a zombie epidemic, and more than one at that. I already mentioned that zombies could somewhat operate machinery. Aboard a Star Destroyer, there are always dozens of shuttle cargo ships and nearly 100 fighters. That means there's more than enough to spread the infection. On one of those ships, the zombies reached several planets. Far from the original source of infection, their connection with each other and with the collective mind was weak. But even in such a state, zombies were very dangerous and could infect a vast number of humans and other species. By the way, almost all known species and animals in the galaxy could be infected with this virus, even rankers. For instance, one of the ships with zombies reached Dathomir. The Imperials quickly sent specialists, a bunch of stormtroopers and other competent professionals to the planet. The Imperials organized a quarantine zone and began methodically shooting and burning the zombies. The Howling Crag clan of the Witches of Dathomir found themselves within the quarantine zone. Every day they fought off zombie attacks. An infected sister was simply killed, her body burned, and the fight continued. The witches also suffered from the Imperials, who burned the zombies along with the clan's witches, even if they hadn't yet been infected. Most astounding was the survival of 3 witches from the Howling Crag clan after being infected. They managed this through their strength and spells. Their names were Denkra Chimeri and Thestriel Chimeri. Other witches of the clan named them the Sisters of the Void. Alas, they could not completely overcome the disease. Day by day, the virus overtook their bodies, poisoned their blood, clouded their minds, and one by one, their internal organs failed. Ultimately, the Sisters of the Void were killed by the Imperials at the request of the clan's matriarch, Amaya Chimeri. Outbreaks of the blackwing virus also occurred on other planets, but they were quickly contained and eradicated by the Imperials, and the affected received a life-saving vaccine and spent the necessary time in quarantine. Blackwing was not the only virus from the distant past. Another ancient plague that caused many epidemics and even a pandemic, though it did not turn people into zombies, was the Candorian plague. Like the blackwing virus, it existed in both the old and the new canon, infecting people. The blue shadow virus was responsible for the Candorian plague, which devastated entire planets. Almost all species in the galaxy could be infected by this virus, and the mortality rate reached nearly 100%. For a long time, the blue shadow virus was considered incurable. Neither respirators nor some biological protection suits could save from it. But let's proceed step by step. The blue shadow virus and the Candorian plague it caused first appeared during the New Sith Wars. Whether the virus was man-made was never established. It is quite possible that the virus was created artificially, as both the Sith and the Jedi used biological and chemical weapons at that time. Moreover, in the distant galaxy, There were never any galactic-wide legal or moral psychological bans on the development and use of chemical and biological weapons. As a result, everyone developed and used them, including private individuals at the behest of other private individuals. And on most planets, this was legal. But let's return to the Blue Shadow virus. The Candorian plague epidemics first erupted between 1100 and 1000 BBY. The virus decimated entire planets and led to pandemics in some sectors of the outer rim and mid-rim. The virus thrived in water and was transmitted by airborne droplets. Many planets sought help from the Republic in the Sith state. The Sith did not care if their own interests were not affected by the virus. At that time, the Republic also could not be bothered with diseases killing billions of people and other races in the outer rim. The entire Republic was on the brink of collapse, barely resisting the onslaught of the Sith's army and fleet. The pandemic, which killed trillions, ceased by itself. However, the Candorian plague did not completely disappear. The Blue Shadow virus was sometimes even used as a biological weapon. The plague resurfaced in 45 BBY in the Candorian colonies. The Blue Shadow virus pandemic completely wiped out the colony's population. With the death of the last infected individual, virologists began to think that the Candorian plague had finally vanished for good, having self-destructed due to the death of all possible hosts, thus being deprived of its nutrient medium. The plague lay in wait for its time. Several decades later, that time arrived. The plague was discovered again, studied, improved, and employed by the biologists of the Confederacy of Independent Systems as part of their biological weapon research against the Grand Army of the Republic. The project was led by the talented, though slightly mad scientist Noghri. He created thousands of viral bombs, which were planned to be detonated in the atmospheres of several key Republic planets, whose factories and industries supported the Republic's military-industrial complex. After all the infected perished and the virus died without hosts, the planet could be colonized anew. However, the Separatists' plans were thwarted. Noghri's laboratory was discovered and destroyed, and in the process, a cure for the virus was found, which turned out to be the Rakghoul root. The assault did not go entirely smoothly. During the battle in the underground research complex, one of the canisters containing the virus was damaged. A blue viral cloud engulfed the entire complex. Several clones of the 501st Legion and Ahsoka Tano were infected. Fortunately, the complex was sealed in time, preventing the virus from spreading among the evergreen fields and meadows of Naboo. Vindy himself was captured and taken to Coruscant. There, his new captors provided him with a new laboratory and allowed him to continue his work, but now in the interests of a Sith. Noghri did not mind working for different employers, much like the previously captured by Republic Commandos and Clones Commando, Dr. Ovalot Kyle Uthan, who had developed the separatist nanovirus FG-36, which targeted clones exclusively. But I will tell you about her work later. For now, let's return to the Blue Shadow virus. The improved strains of the Candorian plague were later used by the Galactic Empire as biological weapons against some rebellious planets and planets that still maintained loyalty to the Confederacy. The new viral strain was difficult to cure. The vaccine discovered during the Clone Wars no longer worked. The new virus had a short incubation period ranging from a few hours to a couple of days, and the progression of the disease from the first to the last moment was accompanied by excruciating pain throughout the body. For the Empire, the Candorian plague served less a practical purpose as a weapon and more a symbolic one, as a threat and a warning. Fortunately, the Empire utilized the Blue Shadow virus only a few times in the early years of its existence and mostly just threatened with this contagion. Often it was more advantageous to take a planet by storm than to conduct viral genocide on it. The last planet subjected to a bombardment of viral bombs was Dental. In a few hours, the virus exterminated hundreds of thousands of people. The capital city of the planet suffered particularly. The entire population of Dental died out within 2 months. Sheev Palpatine's viral arsenal was not limited to the Blue Shadow virus alone. To provide a complete picture, I want to briefly discuss another imperial artificial virus that was used in a limited capacity as a biological weapon. It was less effective than the aforementioned candorian plague, but far more interesting. I'm referring to the virus under the code designation FNV-23, also known as the Grey Death. The creator of the virus was Dr. Noghri, head of the Imperial Biological Weapons Division. Incidentally, the scientists of this department were also involved in the enhancement of the candorian plague. And it was they who were responsible for the deployment of the Blue Shadow virus on Dental. The virus was created under the pathogen-based loyalty enhancement program initiated by Compner, the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order. Virus FNV-23 differed from other types of biological weapons due to its long incubation period and constant mutation. The strain of the virus changed so rapidly that it was practically impossible to find an effective cure, and the victim's body had no chance to develop immunity. However, the mortality rate from FNV-23 in the weeks following infection was comparatively low, and that was part of the intention. However, it caused a great deal of suffering. So, how did Compnor plan to use it? In the Druis sector, Grid Square 016, there is the planetary Sidesia system, where the planet Sidesia is located. Sidesia did not have a robust industry or large reserves of natural resources. It was also situated far from major trade routes. The Empire was attracted to something else entirely. The government of Sidesia provided open support to the rebel alliance. Several large rebel bases, training camps, and other infrastructure were established on the planet. In addition, there were strong anti-imperial sentiments on Sidesia. Something had to be done about this. Instead of acting in their usual manner, that is, carrying out a full-scale intervention with orbital bombardment and stormtrooper landings with armored vehicles, the Empire decided to act more cunningly and simultaneously elevate their own title among the local population. Spores of FNV-23 were secretly dispersed in the atmosphere of Sidesia. Within a mere 2 weeks, 99% of the planet's population was infected with a new and unknown virus. The rebels could neither help the locals nor themselves. Some of the rebels chose to leave the infected planet, abandoning the natives to their fate. They simply did not know what to do with it. The Alliance had neither the resources nor the time to study the virus and develop a vaccine. After waiting for a few weeks, the Empire kindly offered the planet's government humanitarian aid and specialists to combat the disease. By that time, 35,000 local inhabitants had already died on Sidesia. A small number in planetary terms, but enough to seriously worry the local authorities. Incidentally, it was the locals who named the virus Grey Death. The planetary government was forced to agree. Then Compnor specialists and a small military contingent of stormtroopers arrived on the planet. They supposedly studied the virus and supposedly immediately found a cure. The substance brought by the Imperial antiviral agents was known as FNV-23B. Each dose of the medication not only contained substances that alleviated suffering, but also tiny spheres of the Grey Death encased in a polysaccharide coating. Such medicine alleviated suffering and literally returned people to their normal lives, but only for a short time. After a while, a new dose of the medication was required. The Empire had literally addicted an entire planet to dependence. After the start of this imperial aid, the planet's population, which had recently viewed the Imperials as oppressors of freedom, conquerors, and ruthless killers, began to see the Imperials as saviors. Instead of anti-imperial sentiments, anti-rebel sentiments began to emerge in society, which was exactly what the Imperials wanted. While the saving of the population was underway, Imperial intelligence officers, soldiers, and special forces thoroughly targeted the local bases and cells of the rebel alliance. The local application of FNV-23B resulted in the complete eradication of the rebels in the region and a respectful attitude towards the Imperials from the local population. However, this did not last long. A well-prepared special forces group was sent to the planet. Using methods of agent intelligence and infiltration into Imperial facilities, the squad uncovered the truth about the virus's nature and the deceitful treatment. Yes, of course, the rebels informed the locals of what the Empire had done to them, but the locals could no longer refuse such pseudo-treatment. Without the FNV-23B medication, they would all die in a few years in horrific agony. Part of the population, still loyal to the rebel alliance, rose in insurrection, but it was swiftly suppressed by the stormtroopers. The case of Silesia was not the only operation of this kind. Although the Galactic Empire repeated such cases with rebellious planets very rarely, preferring to suppress uprisings through more traditional means. If few are aware of the use of the Imperial virus NV-23 Grey Death, then the following similar trick is undoubtedly known to many. This concerns the Noghri race. Magnificent warriors with astounding skills in stealth and hand-to-hand combat. With an excellent sense of smell, true killing machines. Before the Imperial period, few even knew of their existence. The Noghri lived on their home planet, Noghri. In the second half of the Clone Wars, a space battle took place in the orbit of Noghri, resulting in the Confederacy ship, the Gehenna, crashing onto the planet's surface. It seemed like nothing special, as downed warships often crash onto planetary surfaces. However, the Gehenna had on board an experimental biological weapon of the Separatists, trihexylophene 1138. This contagion provoked a change in the ecosystem on most of the planet, leading to the death of many animals and the planet's only sentient inhabitants. An epidemic of an unknown disease and other ailments, exacerbated by atmospheric poisoning, put the Noghri on the brink of survival. This happened in the year 20 BBY. Already a year and a half after the Clone Wars, uninvited saviors arrived to the Noghri, the Imperials. At least the Noghri considered them saviors at that time. Before the Imperials and especially Darth Vader began negotiations, the Noghri killed the entire Sith Guard, consisting of elite clone stormtroopers of the 501st region. Meanwhile, the Noghri suffered minimal losses. Darth Vader was impressed and offered the Noghri help and alliance. Naturally, the Noghri agreed. In the following decades, Noghri detachments, known as the Noghri Death Commandos, served the Galactic Empire with fanatical devotion, and they idolized Darth Vader and Darth Sidious. Recall that the first 3 years were very difficult times for the young Galactic Empire. Palpatine's rule was uncertain, as there were many who disliked his transformation from Chancellor to absolute monarch to Emperor. Despite the purges conducted in the armed forces, the Emperor still couldn't fully rely on the military to deal with his political opponents and dissidents, and the Galactic Senate had not yet lost its power. And here the apprentice brings to his master magnificent killers, in no way connected either with the Imperial armed forces or with the special services. Naturally, Palpatine immediately put the Noghri squads to use for political assassinations and kidnappings of enemies of the throne. In addition, these squads agreed to assist the then very small Imperial Special Forces, or operated independently, autonomously as reconnaissance and sabotage groups. Besides this, Noghri groups served as bodyguards for high-ranking Imperial officials and military officers. In particular, Grand Admiral Thrawn had a Noghri bodyguard named Rook, who also infiltrated into the new canon. However, in the new Star Wars, his fate is vastly different from what we know from the original Star Wars and the expanded universe. In the original, Rook killed Thrawn right in the Admiral's chair during battle, leading to the defeat of the Imperial fleet in the fateful Battle of Bilbringi in 9 ABY. Until that moment, the Noghri would never have attacked a protected individual. They would have continued to revere the Imperials if Vader's daughter had not revealed the truth about the Empire's aid. Unwilling to lose control over the Noghri, the Imperials merely pretended to terraform Noghri and provided the locals with medicine that only slightly alleviated their suffering, ensuring they wouldn't die. This situation differed, of course, from the FNV-23 Grey Death virus, where the entire population of Silesia was made dependent by the Imperials. But the essence was the same. Leia, respected by the Noghri because of her relation to Vader, promised the race genuine help this time, and she did not deceive them. The New Republic assisted the natives in temporarily resettling on other planets, and seriously undertook the terraforming of Noghri. The gratitude of the Noghri, starting from 9 ABY, was as faithful to the New Republic as it had previously been to the Empire. A squad of Noghri almost always accompanied Leia Organa and had saved her from death many times. Leia faced numerous assassination attempts from killers of all kinds. She had not only many friends and allies, but also many enemies. Many New Republic senators disliked Leia's entourage. It wasn't just that the state leader was accompanied by savages, but those savages were once the Emperor's elite assassins. Unlike the use of the FNV-23 virus, this was an example of Imperial foolishness, not cunning. If the Imperials had truly treated the Noghri's illnesses and, importantly, carried out full-fledged terraforming of the planet, the Noghri would have loved the Imperials to the grave, and Thrawn would still be alive.